was a bright, flawless Saturday morning inside the palatial estate of Mr. Kachi, a sprawling sanctuary of marble, glass, and soaring archways that stood as a towering monument to unimaginable wealth in the heart of the city. To anyone looking from the outside, this house was not just a piece of real estate. It was a fortress of success, a physical manifestation of a man who had conquered the ruthless world of high-tech commerce and heavy industry. Inside the grand living room, where the sunlight poured through floor-to-ceiling windows and danced across priceless pieces of contemporary art, Mr. Kachi sat comfortably on an imported Italian leather couch. He appeared completely relaxed, casually watching a documentary on a massive television screen that dominated the primary wall. But beneath that exterior of absolute tranquility, Kachi was a man carrying a quiet, heavy burden of the heart. He was a multimillionaire, a philanthropist, and an employer to thousands, yet his vast fortune could not buy him the one thing his soul desperately craved: absolute certainty in love. Beside him sat Tarilla, the breathtakingly beautiful woman he intended to make his wife. Tarilla was not a passive observer in the game of life. She was a brilliant, high-achieving corporate executive at a prestigious multinational firm, earning an enviable salary and commanding respect in her own right. She had arrived at Kachi's mansion the previous evening to spend a romantic weekend away from the grueling demands of her corporate schedule, and their time together had been a seamless blur of laughter, shared dreams, and deep connection. After a quiet moment of comfortable silence, Tarilla smiled warmly, her eyes reflecting genuine affection as she gently squeezed his arm and stood up from the plush cushions. "Babe, I'll be right back. I want to take a quick shower and freshen up," she said, her voice carrying a soft, melodic tone that always managed to soothe Kachi's hidden anxieties. "All right, my love," Kachi replied softly, offering a gentle smile without fully breaking his gaze from the television screen, allowing her to walk down the long, echoing hallway toward the master bathroom. As the minutes began to tick away, the initial calm of the morning was suddenly shattered by a violent, echoing vibration that seemed to shake the very foundations of the room. A loud, demanding, and utterly authoritative knock on the heavy mahogany front door. Kachi paused, his eyebrows knitting together in immediate confusion as his eyes locked onto the entryway, wondering who could possibly be arriving unannounced at his private sanctuary on a weekend morning. Before he could even contemplate an answer, a second knock came, this one far firmer, sharper, and more aggressive than the first, practically demanding immediate entry into the residence. Sensing a strange, underlying urgency, Kachi stood up from the couch, his towering frame casting a shadow across the polished marble floor as he walked with measured, confident steps toward the front door. He pulled the massive door open, expecting a courier or perhaps a neighbor, but instead, he was met by the grim, unyielding faces of two sharply dressed men standing on his threshold in dark, identical tailored suits. One of the men, possessing an expression completely void of human emotion, held a thick, heavy brown envelope, his fingers gripping the edges with a cold, professional finality that sent an immediate chill through the air. "Good morning, Mr. Kachi," the first man said, his voice dropping like a heavy stone into the quiet atmosphere of the estate, while Kachi looked at them carefully, his sharp business instincts instantly putting him on high alert. "Who are you, and what is the meaning of this unannounced visit to my private property?" Kachi demanded, his voice projecting the natural authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed in every room he entered. The second man stepped forward, his eyes scanning the luxurious interior of the foyer, with an ominous, chilling indifference before making eye contact with the billionaire. "We are senior recovery agents from the bank," the man stated coldly, just as Tarilla was quietly stepping out of the bathroom at the far end of the hallway, her hair still slightly damp from the shower. She had been heading back to the living room to rejoin her partner when the low, tense rumble of unfamiliar male voices near the entrance caught her attention, causing her to freeze instantly in her tracks. Sensing an immediate shift in the energy of the home, she stayed exactly where she was, hiding behind a decorative pillar and watching the confrontation unfold from a distance, her heart beginning to hammer against her ribs. Kachi's face had completely changed. The calm, relaxed expression of a billionaire enjoying a peaceful Saturday morning was entirely gone, replaced by a tense, rigid mask of pale disbelief. The men extended their arms, handing him the ominous brown envelope without a shred of hesitation or empathy, their movements mechanical and ruthless. "We are here representing the syndicate of financial institutions," the first agent repeated, his voice echoing loudly enough for Tarilla to catch every terrifying word from her hidden vantage point. Your multi-million-dollar business loan is officially 90 days overdue, and the underlying facility has now moved into a catastrophic state of default. We have been legally authorized and sent here today to immediately seize and recover this entire property, along with all associated domestic assets, according to the strict, binding terms of the master collateral agreement you signed. Kachi opened the envelope with visibly trembling hands, his eyes moving over the legal jargon, the red default stamps, and the official court orders nestled inside the paperwork. For a long, agonizing moment, he said absolutely nothing, the crushing weight of the revelation hanging over the room like a suffocating fog while the agent continued his merciless delivery. As of this exact moment, Mr. Kachi, you have exactly 24 hours to completely vacate this house, this estate, your entire collection of luxury sports cars, and all listed personal assets now legally belong to the bank. Kachi slowly lowered his head, his shoulders slumping forward as the sheer, agonizing weight of the moment felt incredibly heavy, a dark cloud of total ruin seemingly swallowing him whole. From her hiding place behind the pillar, Tarilla could no longer stay quiet, the sheer shock of what she was hearing overpowering her natural corporate composure. "What do you mean by that?" she cried out, her voice cracking with a mixture of terror and confusion as she stepped completely out of the shadows, running forward to stand defiantly beside Kachi at the open doorway. "What do you mean everything belongs to the bank? What is happening here? There must be some kind of terrible mistake." The two bank agents looked at her with cold, unblinking eyes, entirely unmoved by her emotional outburst, while Kachi raised his left hand slightly in a gentle but firm gesture of restraint. "Tarilla, please go back into the house," he whispered, his voice trembling with a vulnerability she had never heard in him before. "Please, I will handle this. Just give us a moment." She stepped back by a single fraction of an inch, but her sharp, fiercely protective eyes stayed permanently fixed on the men, searching their faces for any sign of a cruel joke. After a short, incredibly tense legal exchange with Mr. Kachi, where signatures were verified and dates were confirmed, the two men finished delivering their devastating message and turned on their heels, leaving the property without a backward glance. The massive mahogany door clicked closed behind them, the sound echoing through the empty, cavernous house like the final toll of a funeral bell. Kachi stood perfectly still at the door, his forehead resting lightly against the cold wood, his hand remaining frozen on the handle, as if he were trying to hold on to the last remnants of the life he once knew. Tarilla walked closer, her face entirely pale and full of absolute confusion, her mind racing at 1,000,000 miles an hour, trying to reconcile the billionaire she loved with the broken man standing before her. "Sweetheart, please, what on earth is going on?" she asked, her voice dropping to a desperate whisper as she reached out to touch his back. He did not answer at first, his silence stretching out into an agonizing void that made the air in the hallway feel thin and unbreathable. She asked again, louder this time, her hands gripping his arms as she forced him to look at her. "Kachi, talk to me right now. What is happening to your life? What is happening to us?" He finally turned around, his eyes bloodshot, looking older and more exhausted than she had ever seen him in all the years they had been together. "Come sit down with me," he said, his voice entirely devoid of its usual vibrant energy, leading her back toward the living room with heavy, uncoordinated steps. Tarilla sat directly at the very edge of the couch, her body rigid and unable to fully relax, her hands clasped tightly in her lap as she prepared herself for whatever blow was about to land. Kachi sat close to her, his gaze locked onto her face for a long, heartbreaking time before he could even muster the strength to speak. "I've always wanted to tell you about the vulnerabilities in my operations," he began, his voice carrying a deep, echoing sadness. "But I didn't know how to say it without looking weak. I've been incredibly worried about how you would react to the cracks in my armor." Tarilla leaned even closer, her corporate instinct for problem-solving kicking in as she grabbed his hands. "Just say it now, Kachi. Whatever it is, just say it. What is going on with your empire?" Kachi took a long, shaky breath, closing his eyes tightly before delivering the final blow. "I am completely bankrupt." Tarilla blinked rapidly, the word bouncing off the walls of her mind like an impossible mathematical equation that made absolutely no sense. "Bankrupt? What do you mean by that, Kachi? How does a man with your resources just go bankrupt overnight? What really happened behind closed doors?" Kachi continued, his voice dropping into a narrative rhythm that painted a picture of absolute professional catastrophe. There was a massive international Chinese supply conglomerate that I got in contact with several months ago, he explained, staring blankly at the floor. They approached me with an offer that seemed flawless. They told me they could supply our primary consumer goods at a ridiculously low price. A price so low that I could easily make about 3 times more profit than my current margins allowed. It was an undeniably good deal, the kind of deal that could elevate my business to a global scale. He paused, a bitter self-deprecating smile passing over his lips before he continued. At first, being a cautious businessman, I tested them with a very small order. It came in perfectly on time. The quality of the goods was immaculate. Everything looked completely fine, and our local customers absolutely loved them. In fact, the demand was so overwhelming that I sold out the entire inventory in less than 48 hours. Tarilla listened intently, her sharp analytical mind following every word, her face tightening as she began to anticipate the dark twist in the story. After that initial success, I placed another order, this time for a significantly higher amount of capital, Kachi continued, his hands gesturing subtly in the air. The goods came in just like before, and the quality was still exceptionally good. I sold everything quickly once again, and my revenue streams were skyrocketing. I was really happy with the progress, and I fully let my guard down. I trusted them implicitly. Kachi shook his head slightly, a deep sigh escaping his chest as the memory of his own miscalculation seemed to visibly age him. That was where everything went completely wrong. I came up with an aggressive expansion idea to take a massive, multi-million-dollar loan from a consortium of banks so I could place an unprecedentedly large order and simultaneously supply all my primary branches across the entire city. He shook his head again, his voice cracking with raw emotion. The moment the wire transfer cleared, the money was gone. No goods ever arrived at the port. No tracking numbers worked. Nothing came at all. It was a phantom operation, a highly sophisticated international scam. Tarilla gasped softly, her hand moving to her mouth as the true scale of the disaster became painfully clear. I later learned through private investigators that this exact kind of predatory tactic happens frequently to fast-growing companies like mine, Kachi continued, his voice laced with absolute defeat. They deliberately supply small orders at incredibly good prices, even if it means they are losing money or adding their own capital just to build an ironclad sense of trust. Then they wait patiently until you make a life-altering, monumental order, before they sever all communication and completely disappear into the dark web. Tarilla's face changed entirely, her mind spinning as she stared at the man she had envisioned a golden future with. Kachi continued, his voice barely audible now. I tried everything humanly possible to fix it over the last few weeks. I tried to restructure the debts, I tried to liquidate my secondary holdings, and I tried to pay back the loan in different ways. Absolutely nothing worked. The interest compounded too quickly. That is why the bank enforcement team came this morning. A heavy, suffocating silence filled the massive living room, pressing down on both of them like a physical weight. Tarilla looked at him closely, her eyes showing a complex whirlwind of shock, deep pain, and utter disbelief, as she processed the reality that the life of luxury they had built together was dissolving into thin air. She felt many strong, conflicting emotions tearing through her heart all at once. She did not know what to say, how to react, or whether she should run away from the impending chaos. For a long, frozen moment, it felt like the entire world had stopped spinning, leaving them suspended in a vacuum of total financial ruin. Then, in a display of remarkable inner strength, she consciously shifted her expression, forcing her own panic into the background, as she tried to stay strong for the man she loved. She did not want Kachi to completely break down or lose his dignity in front of her. She reached out, holding both of his trembling hands tightly within her own, looking directly into his shattered eyes with absolute intensity. Kachi, she said, her voice steady, firm, and filled with an unexpected, fierce devotion. Listen to me, everything will be fine. Just stay strong, do you hear me? I truly believe this is just a temporary phase in your life. Things will get better. Life has its beautiful good times and its devastating bad times. And this is simply one of those bad times. But you cannot give up on yourself. You are a visionary, and you will rise again. The very same God who helped you build this empire from scratch before will surely help you find your footing again. Kachi did not speak. He simply stared at her, his eyes searching her face for any sign of deception or hidden resentment. Tarilla then asked a quiet, practical question, her tone shifting to immediate logistics. So the bank is coming tomorrow morning to officially take possession of this house. Where will you stay now, Kachi? Do you have any alternative properties? Do you have a plan? Kachi looked down at his lap, the picture of utter helplessness. Honestly, Tarilla, I don't know. I don't have any plan at all. Every single asset tied to my name has been frozen or earmarked for liquidation, he answered. Tarilla became completely silent for a moment, her mind weighing the gravity of what she was about to offer. She took a deep, centering breath, looked down at their joined hands, and then spoke with absolute certainty. If you don't mind, Kachi, you can come and stay at my place. She looked up, meeting his eyes, and added with a touch of vulnerability. It is a modest apartment. It is not nearly as big or fancy as this palace. I don't even know if a man of your stature will be comfortable sleeping there. Mr. Kachi, who had been looking down at the floor in simulated shame, slowly lifted his head and looked at her, his voice becoming incredibly emotional. I will really truly appreciate it, Tarilla, he whispered. Thank you for not turning your back on me. Then let's not waste any time. Let's get your things ready right now, Tarilla said, her practical nature taking over as she stood up. They both moved through the cavernous house, their footsteps echoing loudly against the walls as Kachi began packing his expensive clothes into a few select designer suitcases. Tarilla did not stand by idly. She actively helped him fold his shirts, organize his basic necessities, and pack up his life, her actions showing a complete lack of hesitation. Very soon they were done, the physical remnants of his grand life reduced to just a few bags. Together they carried the heavy suitcases outside into the blinding Saturday sun, where Tarilla's modest sedan was parked in the massive compound, looking tiny against the backdrop of Kachi's soon-to-be seized luxury vehicles. They placed the heavy luggage into the trunk, the metallic thud of the trunk closing sounding incredibly final. Kachi paused, taking one last long lingering look at the towering facade of the big house. A look that seemed to hold all the grief of a man losing his kingdom. And then, he opened the passenger door and entered the car, pulling his seatbelt across his chest. Tarilla joined him in the driver's seat, her hands gripping the steering wheel firmly as she started the engine. The car began moving, rolling slowly down the long driveway and out through the security gates, leaving the life of a millionaire behind. Inside the car, as they navigated the busy city streets, there was absolutely no conversation. Only a dense, heavy silence filled the cabin. It was a silence that carried the unsaid weight of a massive life transition, a quiet before a storm that neither of them could fully predict. After a long, agonizingly quiet drive across the city away from the affluent neighborhoods, they finally arrived at a quiet, middle-class residential area. Tarilla carefully parked the car in front of a decent standard apartment building that housed several ordinary working-class families. Kachi stepped out of the vehicle and looked around the modest compound, watching children playing in the distance and neighbors hanging up laundry. He took a deep, profound breath, as if inhaling the reality of his new, simplified existence. Then he walked to the back of the car, popped the trunk, and brought out his heavy suitcases. Tarilla also came down from the driver's seat, immediately moving to his side to help him carry the load. Together, their bodies straining slightly under the weight, they carried the suitcases up the stairs and into Tarilla's apartment. No one spoke much during the process, but something incredibly heavy hung in the air between them. A profound shift in dynamics that was not yet fully understood by either soul. Later that evening, after they had finally settled into the apartment and his clothes had been placed in her modest closet, Kachi's mind appeared to become a little calm. Tarilla had been moving tirelessly all day, making sure the space was clean, preparing a comfortable spot for him, and doing everything in her power to ensure he felt emotionally supported, and her genuine kindness slowly helped him relax. Kachi sat quietly on one of the simple fabric chairs in her small living room, staring blankly into the distance, completely lost in his own complex thoughts. The contrast was staggering. Earlier that very morning, he had been lounging inside one of the biggest, most luxurious houses in the entire city. Now, as the sun dipped below the horizon, he was sitting in a confined apartment, surrounded by the ordinary items of a standard corporate employee. Life truly changed without a single word of warning, stripping away titles and wealth in the blink of an eye. Tarilla quietly came out from the small kitchen, carrying 2 glasses of fresh orange juice on a tray, her face showing signs of physical exhaustion, but her eyes still burning with warmth. She handed one of the glasses directly to Kachi, her touch gentle. "Please drink something, Kachi," she said softly. Kachi took the glass, his fingers brushing against hers. Thank you, Tarilla, he replied, his voice thick with unexpressed emotion. Terfila sat down on the chair directly across from him, crossing her legs. For a short, fragile moment there was a profound silence between them, a quiet that did not feel normal at all. It carried the immense weight of fear, the terrifying uncertainty of the future, and a million unanswered questions about what tomorrow would bring. Mr. Kachi looked at Tarilla again, taking in her calm demeanor, before he finally broke the silence, his voice carrying a deep, trembling emotion that shook the quiet room. Tarilla, I honestly don't know how to properly thank you for everything you are doing for me right now. He looked down briefly at the juice glass in his hands, his knuckles turning white. To be completely honest with you, I was absolutely terrified to tell you what was happening while my entire empire was falling apart over the last few weeks. He looked back up, his eyes glassy. I kept thinking to myself, what if I lose my business, and then as a consequence I lose you too? The fear of you walking away was paralyzing, but you didn't leave me to suffer alone. You stood firmly by me when things became unimaginably difficult. You opened your private home to me without making me feel small or ashamed of my failure. He paused, taking a shaky breath, trying desperately to control the rising tide of his emotions. Tarilla, thank you for staying. Thank you for believing in my worth when I could not even see clearly myself. I swear to you, I will never ever forget kindness as long as I live. Tarilla looked at him, her expression melting into pure empathy as she reached across the small gap between their chairs. It's all right, Kachi, she said firmly. You don't need to keep thanking me over and over again. You are my partner, the man I chose. This is exactly what I am supposed to do when the person I love is hurting. She leaned forward, placing her hand securely on his shoulder, her grip strong. And I want you to listen to me very carefully right now, she added, her eyes locking onto his. Everything will eventually be fine. We are in this together, through the thick and the thin. Those powerful words touched something deep inside Kachi's heart, sending a wave of profound realization through his soul. For a long moment he just kept looking at her, completely awestruck by her unconditional loyalty. Thank you, he whispered once more, the words feeling inadequate for the depth of what he felt. Tarilla gave a faint, encouraging smile. All you need to do right now is maintain your focus, she said constructively. You are the same brilliant man who built a fortune before. You can absolutely rise again from the ashes. I believe in you with all my heart, and I am rooting for you every single day. This financial setback is not the end of your life, Kachi. It is just the beginning of a new chapter. Kachi gave a weak, appreciative smile, nodding his head slowly. Tarilla watched him quietly as he drank his juice, and for the very first time since the bank agents had arrived that morning, she could see just how broken he truly looked beneath his calm exterior. It was a heartbreaking sight, not just because of the loss of the money, but because a powerful, brilliant man, who was once universally respected everywhere he walked, suddenly had nothing left to his name but the clothes on his back. 2 days later, the reality of their new routine began to fully set in. Tarilla returned from a long, grueling day at her corporate office that Monday evening, her shoulders tense from the stress of the marketplace. The very moment she turned the key and entered the apartment, Kachi walked toward her from the kitchen, a warm, bright smile lighting up his face. Welcome back home, my love, he said, his voice cheerful and welcoming. Tarilla smiled tiredly, setting her heavy briefcase down on the entryway table. Thank you, babe, she replied, letting out a long sigh. Kachi gently reached out and held both of her hands in his, rubbing his thumbs over her knuckles. How was work today? Was the corporate world kind to you? He asked with genuine interest. Tarilla let out a small, exhausted breath and smiled up at him. It was incredibly stressful as usual, she replied, rolling her eyes playfully. The quarterly targets are mounting, but I survived the day. Both of them laughed softly together, the sound relieving some of the tension in the room. Then, Kachi looked at her with a mischievous, playful expression dancing in his eyes. Guess what? He said, tilting his head. Tarilla narrowed her eyes at him, a amused smile tugging at the corners of her lips. You know perfectly well that I am absolutely terrible at guessing games after a long day at the office, she replied playfully. Just try to guess just once, Kachi, he insisted, his smile widening. Tarilla folded her arms dramatically across her chest, leaning back against the wall. No, I completely refuse to guess. Kachi laughed heartily, a sound that filled the small apartment with vibrant life. All right then, since you refuse, he said proudly, I prepared your absolute favorite gourmet meal for dinner tonight. Tarilla's eyes widened immediately in total shock, her hands flying up to cover her mouth in utter surprise. What? She exclaimed, her voice rising an octave. Are you actually serious right now? Since when did the great Mr. Kachi start cooking domestic meals? Kachi smiled proudly, puffing out his chest in a display of playful arrogance. Well, I wanted to surprise you, my love, to show my appreciation. Now go and quickly freshen up while I beautifully set the table for us. Tarilla shook her head in pure amusement, a deep sense of happiness washing over her. Okay, chef, she said with a bright smile. I absolutely can't wait to taste your creation. A short while later, both of them sat closely at the small dining table, the aroma of a wonderfully cooked meal filling the air. Tarilla carefully took the first spoonful of the food, lifting it to her lips while Kachi watched her with intense anticipation. The very moment she tasted it, her eyes widened even further than before, the flavors exploding on her palate. What on earth? She said again, looking across the table at Kachi in absolute disbelief. Are you entirely sure you made this masterpiece yourself without ordering takeout? Kachi laughed warmly, his heart swelling at her reaction. I swear on my life, I made it myself from scratch. Wow, Kachi, this is actually incredibly good. You've been hiding this talent from me, she praised. Both of them laughed joyfully as they continued eating together, the dark clouds of bankruptcy completely forgotten for a brief, beautiful moment. The atmosphere in the modest house felt remarkably warm, peaceful, and grounded in pure connection. But midway into the meal, Kachi slowly cleared his throat, his demeanor shifting as he set his fork down. His playful expression vanished, replaced by a serious, contemplative look. Sweetheart, he said, his voice dropping into a lower register. While you were away at work today, I sat here and thought deeply about my current situation. Tarilla stopped eating, looking at him quietly, sensing the gravity of the shift. Okay, she said softly, setting her own utensils down. Kachi continued, his eyes reflecting a deep resolve. You know me, Tarilla. I am simply not the type of man who can sit around at home all day, doing absolutely nothing while you work yourself to the bone. He paused briefly, choosing his words with immense care. So, I have been thinking things through. I want to start looking for employment immediately. I want to get a job. Tarilla raised a skeptical eyebrow, her corporate mind instantly evaluating the harsh realities of the job market. Job, Kachi? Yes, Kachi answered firmly. I will prepare my professional CV tomorrow morning and start applying to companies across the city. Tarilla stayed completely quiet for a few agonizing seconds, looking down at her plate before speaking with brutal but loving honesty. Kachi, can I be completely honest with you about how the corporate world works? Of course, please be honest, he replied, leaning forward. She adjusted herself on her chair, her tone becoming that of an experienced executive. It may not work out the way you are thinking in your head. Kachi looked at her carefully, waiting for her explanation. The reality is that most companies out there are aggressively looking for young, entry-level graduates now. The positions they usually advertise publicly are strictly junior staff positions. She paused briefly, her eyes filled with sympathy, before continuing. You are already over 30 years old, Kachi. With your immense level of past executive experience running your own major empire, the only kind of position you should realistically apply for is senior management. Those high-level positions are incredibly rare, highly political, and not easy to find through standard applications. Kachi listened intently, without interrupting her analysis. Tarilla continued, her voice soft but realistic. And even if you do swallow your pride and get employed as a junior staff member, how much will the monthly salary really be? How long will it realistically take you to save enough capital from a basic salary to stand on your own 2 feet and rebuild your business? Kachi leaned back into the chair, a heavy sigh escaping him. Deep down, he knew her professional assessment was entirely accurate. Starting from the absolute bottom of the corporate ladder at his age would be an uphill battle. You're completely right, he admitted, his shoulders sinking slightly. The room became quiet again, the initial warmth of the dinner fading into the background. Tarilla rested her back against the chair, her brow furrowing as if she was thinking deeply about a creative solution to an impossible problem. Then she looked up, her eyes shining with a sudden inspiration. Kachi, what if you consider becoming an independent taxi driver for the time being? Kachi looked up immediately, his eyes widening in complete shock at the suggestion. A taxi driver, Tarilla? Yes, Tarilla replied quickly, her voice filled with enthusiasm. I regularly hear that people who operate on e-hailing ride platforms like Uber make incredibly good, consistent money every single day. she explained. At least it can help you earn liquid cash much faster while you patiently plan your next major business move. Most of the dedicated drivers even make a lot more money than some mid-level corporate managers earn in a full month. It will help you save capital much faster and also give you the ultimate time and freedom to think clearly without a boss breathing down your neck. Then, once you've saved enough, you can raise your own money and start your true business again. Kachi stayed entirely quiet for a long moment, taking her radical words in, his mind processing the image of a former millionaire driving strangers around the city. Tarilla noticed the complex look of hesitation on his face and immediately reached across the table. This is only a temporary stepping stone, Kachi, she added reassuringly. It doesn't mean you're going to be a taxi driver forever. It's just a strategic pivot. Kachi remained completely silent, staring at her. Then, Tarilla said something so profoundly selfless that it shook him to his absolute core. You can use my car to do it. Kachi turned his head and looked at her immediately, his breath catching in his throat. For a wild moment he genuinely thought he had heard her wrongly. Your car? He asked, his voice shaking. Yes, Tarilla answered without a single shred of hesitation. She moved her chair closer to his, reaching out to place her warm hands securely over his trembling fingers. Sweetheart, your financial problem is no longer just your problem. It is now our collective problem to solve together. Kachi kept staring at her in absolute disbelief, a profound emotion washing over him. That exact moment touched him more deeply than anything else in his entire life. Many chaotic thoughts ran through his mind in rapid succession. He vividly remembered the countless horror stories he had heard in business circles. Stories of ambitious women instantly leaving their men the very moment they encountered severe financial problems or lost their status. But here was Tarilla, a successful corporate woman, willingly offering him her most valuable personal asset, her own car, after he had already lost everything and had nothing left to offer her in return. All you need to do, Tarilla continued, her voice filled with a beautiful, collaborative spirit, is simply drop me off at my office every morning before you start your shifts, and then pick me up in the evening, as long as you're not too far away from my building. You can use the car freely throughout the entire day to make your money. Kachi tried to speak, his lips parting, but he was so incredibly emotional that the words completely refused to come out properly. The syllables died in his throat as a lump formed there. Tarilla stretched her other hand out, holding his hands warmly, her eyes projecting an ocean of safety. It's okay, Kachi, she said softly. Everything will be perfectly fine. Very soon, there will be more than enough money for you to launch your business empire again. At that exact moment, something fundamental inside Kachi's heart changed forever. He looked at Tarilla as if he was seeing a completely different, deeply transcendent side of her soul, and that pure side touched him so deeply that he knew his life would never be the same again. As they had meticulously planned, Kachi drove Tarilla to her office early that Tuesday morning, the city roads already chaotic and busy with commuters. Inside the cabin of the sedan, the atmosphere was profoundly quiet, a calm energy enveloping them. Kachi kept his eyes focused tightly on the asphalt ahead, while Tarilla looked over at him from time to time, her heart swelling with admiration for his willingness to adapt. When they finally arrived at the towering corporate skyscraper where Tarilla worked, Kachi smoothly parked the vehicle near the main entrance. Tarilla turned her body toward him, her hand resting on the door handle as she asked, You're still going to the official Uber Vehicle Inspection Center today, right? Yes, my dear. I've already booked an appointment for mid-morning, Kachi said, offering a reassuring nod. All right, that's perfect, she replied, her voice filled with love. And please, Kachi, promise me you won't think too much or let negative thoughts cloud your mind today, she added gently. Everything will be fine. Kachi managed to force a small, genuine smile onto his face. I will try my best, Tarilla. Tarilla stepped out of the car, adjusting her handbag over her shoulder, and Kachi waited patiently until she had safely entered the building before driving out into the busy stream of traffic. Meanwhile, inside the bustling office, Tarilla sat at her desk trying desperately to focus on her corporate spreadsheets, but her mind kept violently drifting back to Kachi. She vividly remembered the raw look of devastation in his eyes when the bank official had delivered the eviction notice that fateful morning, and the memory broke her heart into a million pieces. She picked up a heavy financial file from her desk, forcing herself to read the print, but her thoughts were miles away, wandering through the reality of their new life. She imagined how incredibly painful it must be for a man like Kachi. At this exact moment, just 2 short days ago, the most powerful people in the city respected him immensely. His name alone made impossible things easy. Crowds literally stood up in reverence whenever he walked into a high society room. Now, in the tragic span of 24 hours, everything he had worked for was completely gone, reduced to a humble rideshare application. Tarilla felt an agonizing, deep pain radiating inside her heart, not because she cared about the loss of the luxurious lifestyle or the money, but because the man she truly deeply loved was hurting so badly. Her eyes became wet with hot tears, and before she could stop them, a few lonely tears rolled down her face, splashing onto the documents below. She lowered her head onto her desk for a brief moment, her voice a fragile whisper in the empty office. "Kachi," she breathed, her heart aching as she imagined him driving around the indifferent city, pretending to be incredibly strong for her sake while carrying a mountain of internal pain. That single thought hurt her more deeply than any personal failure ever could, but after a few moments of vulnerability, Tarilla resolutely wiped her tears away with a tissue. Then she sat up properly, squaring her shoulders as a fierce determination took over her countenance. She made a quiet, ironclad promise to herself in that quiet office. She would remain an immovable pillar of strength for Kachi during this storm. That was exactly what he needed from his future wife right now. Not another broken person crying beside him, and certainly not someone losing hope in his destiny. He desperately needed a partner who would stand unflinchingly beside him in the trenches, until he could stand on his own feet again. Tarilla took a deep, cleansing breath, pushing the heavy thoughts away, and forced her entire mind to focus on her corporate duties for the rest of the day. No. Hours later, the evening finally came, and the corporate building emptied as workers began leaving one after another. Tarilla packed her belongings into her briefcase and walked out through the grand main entrance, the setting sun casting long, golden shadows across the pavement. She brought out her mobile phone, completely intending to call Kachi to see where he was, but before she could even dial his number, she heard a familiar horn honk nearby. She looked up immediately, her eyes searching the street, and a bright smile broke across her face when she saw her own car parked waiting for her. Kachi was already there, standing outside the vehicle. Tarilla stopped in her tracks for a moment, her sharp eyes noticing something different on his face for the first time since the weekend. A calm, warm, and genuinely peaceful smile. It wasn't a massive, ecstatic grin, but it was more than enough to show her that he was genuinely trying to find joy in the middle of his struggle. Kachi stepped forward with a confident stride as she walked closer, gently collecting her heavy bag from her hand and pulling her into a soft, protective hug. "Hello, my beautiful girl. How was the battle at work today?" he asked with a warm smile before turning to open the passenger door for her with old-school gallantry. Tarilla looked at him quietly, deeply moved by the fact that even with the immense weight of the world on his shoulders, he still found the capacity to care for her comfort. That realization touched her heart deeply, and a beautiful smile appeared on her face as she entered the car. Kichi gently closed the door, walked around to the driver's seat, and they smoothly drove out of the company premises into the evening traffic. Weeks quickly passed by, and a comfortable, steady routine slowly formed in their shared lives. Every single morning without fail, Kachi would drive Tarilla directly to her corporate office, wishing her success, and every evening he would faithfully return to pick her up and bring her back to the safety of the apartment. Day after day, their life looked remarkably calm and harmonious on the surface, but while their private daily life appeared peaceful, an entirely different predatory situation was developing right outside their door. Tarilla's older landlord, a wealthy and arrogant man named Mr. Apochi, had started noticing something highly unusual happening on his property. He kept seeing Kachi coming and going from Tarilla's apartment far more frequently than ever before, his presence becoming a constant fixture. At first, it made absolutely no sense to his transactional mind. He thought back to the aggressive, romantic advances he had made toward Tarilla several months ago, where he had explicitly told her that if she agreed to be his mistress, she would never have to pay a single cent of rent again. But Tarilla had fiercely rejected him, telling him in no uncertain terms that she was already in a deeply serious relationship with a powerful millionaire named Mr. Kachi. Back then, Mr. Apochi had begrudgingly stepped back because he knew there was simply no way an ordinary landlord could compete with a man of Kachi's immense wealth and high social status. But now, looking through the blinds of his office, things looked vastly different. Mr. Kachi used to arrive in a fleet of exotic luxury cars, but recently, he had been moving around the property like an ordinary working-class citizen. This radical shift made the landlord intensely curious, so he began making a few private inquiries and findings of his own through mutual acquaintances in the city. Soon enough, he discovered the unbelievable truth. Mr. Kachi had truly lost his massive business empire, gone completely bankrupt, and was now living out of Darilla's modest apartment while working as a common Uber driver. After discovering this truth, dark, manipulative thoughts began to form in the landlord's mind. He viewed this financial tragedy as the perfect, golden opportunity to exploit Tarilla's vulnerability, especially since her monthly rent was now currently overdue by about a week. The very next morning, Tarilla and Kachi were inside the apartment getting ready to face the day ahead. Kachi had just stepped out of the bathroom and was in the bedroom getting dressed, while Tarilla was organizing her papers in the living room when a heavy, aggressive knock rattled the front door. As she opened it, she was confronted by the smug, condescending face of Mr. Apochi. "Good morning, landlord," she greeted, keeping her tone strictly professional despite the discomfort she felt. "Good morning to you, Tarilla, Mr. Apochi responded, his eyes scanning the apartment greedily. "I hope you fully understand that your monthly rent is officially due, and I have not received a single dime of payment from your account yet. This is highly unlike you. You do not usually wait for me to come down here and remind you of your financial obligations." Tarilla took a deep, controlled breath, trying to maintain her composure. "I am well aware of the situation, sir. I just haven't completed the full amount yet due to some unexpected expenses. I will receive my corporate salary at the very end of the month, and I promise to pay every single cent I owe you immediately." But Mr. Apochi cut her off with a dismissive wave of his hand, a cruel, mocking smile spreading across his face. "Why on earth are you putting yourself through all these completely unnecessary financial difficulties, Tarilla? If you had simply swallowed your pride and agreed to be with a real man like me months ago, we wouldn't even be having this embarrassing conversation about rent right now." At that exact moment, Kachi quietly stepped out of the bedroom into the hallway, completely overhearing the landlord's disrespectful words, and he stood perfectly still in the shadows, listening to the unfolding drama. "Mr. Apochi continued, his voice dripping with condescension. "I already promised to completely take care of your every need and let you stay in this beautiful apartment absolutely rent-free for the rest of your life." He leaned a little forward, intentionally looking past her shoulder into the living room where he could see Keiichi standing. "But instead of choosing security, you foolishly chose to stay with a broken man who has lost everything he ever owned, a pathetic man who now spends his days driving random strangers around the city as an Uber driver. Honestly, I don't even understand it," he continued, laughing mockingly. "A full-grown, able-bodied man staying inside a woman's house, depending on your salary like a child. Why would any man with dignity reduce himself to such a shameful state?" Those toxic words hit the quiet room like a physical blow, and Tarilla's face instantly changed as a wave of pure, unadulterated anger rose within her chest. "Enough!" she shouted, her voice booming through the apartment with a protective ferocity that startled the landlord. "Don't you ever dare speak about my man like that in my presence again, Mr. Apochi did not back away, his arrogance shielding him from her wrath. "I am only stating the plain truth that everyone in this neighborhood can see with their own eyes, Tarilla," he replied smugly. "A bankrupt man like that has absolutely no future to offer a woman like you. He is a sinking ship." That was the exact moment Tarilla's voice became ice-cold and terrifyingly firm. "I said that is enough, Mr. Apochi. My private relationship is absolutely none of your business. I am not interested in you, I never have been, and I never ever will be under any circumstances. And about the outstanding rent, I already told you clearly. You will receive your money at the end of the month when my salary clears." She gestured her hands forward sharply, physically commanding him to step back from her threshold. "Now, get away from my door and leave my property immediately." Mr. Apochi adjusted his expensive jacket, a bitter, resentful look crossing his face as he walked away down the corridor. Tarilla slammed the door shut, the loud, echoing sound vibrating through the entire apartment like a declaration of war. As she turned around, her breathing ragged from the confrontation, she saw Kachi standing there in the hallway, looking at her with an unreadable expression, but he did not say a single word about the insulting spectacle he had just witnessed, at least, not yet. An intense, heavy silence settled between them in the living room. Kachi did not ask any questions about the landlord's past advances, and he did not react with anger or wounded pride. But deep down in the silent recesses of his soul, he knew that what he had just witnessed was yet another monumental, ironclad proof of her absolute loyalty and love for him. Then Kachi looked at Tarilla, his voice calm and steady as he asked, "Sweetheart, are you ready? Shall we leave for work now?" "Yes, I am ready," she said, taking a deep breath to calm her racing heart, and they both left the apartment together to face the busy city. Later that night, long after the chaotic day had ended, the lights inside the modest apartment were turned down low, casting a soft, calm glow over the bedroom. Kachi and Tarilla had finally gone to bed, the quiet of the night enveloping them. Tarilla lay closely beside Kachi, her eyes heavy with a deep sleep after a long, emotionally taxing day at the office. Then, Kachi gently reached out and tapped her shoulder with a light, tentative touch. "Sweetheart," he whispered into the dark. She slowly opened her eyes, turning her body toward him in the bed, and even in the dim light, she could see his face clearly. Something was distinctly different about his expression. He looked incredibly serious, carrying a profound weight. Tarilla immediately sat up in the bed, her protective instincts instantly flaring as she looked down at him. "Babe, why on earth are you still awake at this hour? You look deeply worried," she said, her voice filled with concern. "Is anything the matter? Are you feeling okay?" Kachi took a long, deliberate moment to gather his thoughts before speaking, his voice dropping into a quiet, intimate register. "I heard every single word the landlord said to you about the overdue rent this morning, Tarilla." Tarilla looked down at the blanket for a moment, a flash of discomfort passing over her face. Kachi went on, his voice laced with absolute tenderness. "I know you were intentionally trying not to bother me with the financial bills, and I know that is the exact reason you didn't tell me about the rent being late. But I feel incredibly bad that you had to carry that heavy burden all by yourself because of my situation." Tarilla looked up, meeting his eyes in the darkness. "Babe," she said quietly, her voice soft, "I'm so sorry I didn't tell you about it. I genuinely did not want to add any more mental pressure on your shoulders. I know the massive emotional trauma you are going through right now trying to deal with the loss of your business, and I wanted to protect you from the small things." Kachi listened to her words with intense care, his heart deeply moved by her protective nature. Then he asked a quiet question. "How much is left to completely clear the rent balance?" Tarilla hesitated for a second before softly whispering the exact amount to him. Kachi thought quietly for a brief moment, then he spoke with absolute certainty. "I have up to that exact amount right now." Tarilla looked at her bankrupt partner in total surprise, her eyes wide. Kachi continued, a gentle smile appearing on his face. "I've been meticulously saving a little bit of money every day, from the fares I earn driving the Uber car. I can give you the full amount right now, so you can settle the landlord tomorrow and hold your head high." Tarilla quickly shook her head, pushing his hands away gently. "No, babe, absolutely not. You need that hard-earned money infinitely more than I do right now to rebuild your life. I will easily pay the landlord when my corporate salary arrives at the end of the month." Kachi tried again, his grip on her hand tightening. "I really truly want to do this for us, Tarilla. Like you said before, we are in this together." Tarilla held his hand securely, looking at him with immense admiration. "I know we are, Kachi," she said softly but firmly. "But, please, keep your savings in your account. It is simply not the right time to use your hard-earned capital like that. We need to be strategic." A beautiful, peaceful silence settled over the bedroom once again, and Kachi looked at her closely, seeing the unshakable determination in her eyes. "Babe," she said softly, leaning closer, "everything will eventually be perfectly fine. We are going to be more than okay, I promise you." Those powerful words hung beautifully in the air between them, and Kachi did not speak another word. He simply held her hand tightly against his chest, his heart overflowing. After a while, Tarilla gently rested her head on his broad shoulder, and Kachi placed his strong arm securely around her, pulling her into his embrace. In that quiet, humble room, both of them stayed locked in that position for a very long time, drawing strength from one another. Inside that silent room, something infinitely deeper than wealth was forming between them, a silent, sacred promise that no matter what chaotic trials life brought next, they would never have to face the darkness alone. Slowly their eyes closed, and they both fell into a deep, peaceful sleep, holding on to each other as the world spun on outside. 2 full months passed by in a flash of routine, and life began to feel incredibly steady and stable for Kachi and Tarilla. Every single day followed the exact same harmonious pattern. Kachi would drive Tarilla to her corporate office in the morning, work his shifts, and faithfully return in the evening to pick her up. One quiet Saturday morning, the apartment was filled with a serene calm. Tarilla was relaxing in the living room, while Kachi was in the bedroom getting dressed to head out for a few hours. Suddenly, a sharp, unexpected knock echoed through the front door. Tarilla walked over casually and opened it, but the moment she saw who was standing on the threshold, the color completely drained from her face, her expression changing instantly. It was her conservative, fiercely critical mother, Mrs. Bulma, standing there with a discerning look. "Mom! You didn't give me any warning that you were coming down to visit," Tarilla said, her voice cracking with sudden nervousness. Mrs. Bulma smiled a little, a sharp, analytical smile, as she stepped past her daughter into the apartment. "I wanted to surprise my beautiful daughter, of course," she said, her eyes immediately scanning the small living room with a judgmental intensity. Tarilla became visibly anxious, her posture stiffening as she stepped aside to let her mother fully enter the space. Mrs. Bulma narrowed her eyes, instantly picking up on her daughter's tense energy. "What on earth is going on here, Tarilla? Are you not happy to see your own mother? You look incredibly nervous, as if you are hiding something from me." Before Tarilla could even attempt to craft a diplomatic answer, she heard the distinct sound of footsteps approaching from the hallway. Kachi was walking out of the bedroom, completely unaware of the visitor. Mrs. Bulma turned her head sharply, her eyes instantly locking onto him as he emerged. He was dressed incredibly simply in a plain t-shirt and jeans, ready for a day of work. Tarilla quickly straightened her spine, knowing her mother had already seen him, and that there was no turning back. "What on earth is the meaning of this?" Mrs. Bulma asked sharply, her voice cutting through the room like a knife. "Tarilla, what is a strange man doing inside your private apartment on a Saturday morning?" Tarilla tried to speak, her hands gesturing nervously. "Mom, please, it's not what you think at all." Just then, Kachi stepped fully into the room but stopped dead in his tracks when he saw the stern, elderly woman staring at him with undisguised hostility. Tarilla quickly turned to Kachi, trying to bridge the gap. "Babe, this is my mother, Mrs. Bulma," she said breathlessly. Then she turned back to her mother, her voice filled with pride despite the tension. "Mom, this is Kachi, the brilliant man I've been telling you about in my letters." Kachi immediately greeted her with deep politeness, stepping forward with an open, respectful smile. "Good morning, Ma. It is an absolute honor to finally meet you in person," he said warmly. "Your daughter and I were actually already planning to travel down and visit you next month." But Mrs. Bulma did not respond to his greeting at all. Her sharp eyes stayed completely fixed on his simple clothing, her silence dripping with disapproval. A few moments later, sensing the thick tension, Kachi politely excused himself to run his errands, leaving the house. The moment the door closed behind him, a brief, suffocating silence filled the space between Tarilla and her mother. Then Mrs. Bulma turned on her heel, her face entirely serious as she pointed a finger at her daughter. "Start talking right now, Tarilla," she demanded. "What on earth is going on inside this house?" Tarilla took a deep, stabilizing breath, looking her mother dead in the eye. "That is Kachi, Mom, the exact man I want to spend the rest of my life with and marry. I already told you all about his incredible business achievements before, but he recently encountered a massive financial catastrophe. He went completely bankrupt, Mom. We are currently just trying to stick together and rebuild his life from scratch." Mrs. Bulma listened intently, but her face stayed completely hardened and serious, entirely unmoved by the romance of the struggle. Tarilla continued, her voice rising in defense of her partner. "He is working incredibly hard right now, Mom. He's doing everything he can to raise capital to relaunch his enterprise." Mrs. Bulma said absolutely nothing response, stopping her questions because she knew her daughter's stubborn character. Once Tarilla made up her mind about someone, it was nearly impossible to change it. That same evening, Kachi returned home from a long day, entering the living room only to find Mrs. Bulma sitting rigidly on the couch, the air in the apartment feeling incredibly heavy and toxic. He walked in politely and greeted her. "Good evening, Ma." She did not reply to his greeting at all, she simply stared at him with cold, calculating eyes. After a long, agonizing pause that made the room feel incredibly small, she finally spoke, her voice laced with venom. "Kachi, or whatever it is you call yourself, Why on earth are you shamelessly staying inside my daughter's apartment? Kachi sat down calmly on the chair across from her, maintaining his dignity. I am truly sorry, Ma, if my presence here has caused you or the family any form of inconvenience. Believe me, Ma, this is strictly a temporary situation while I re-strategize. Mrs. Bulma stood up from the couch immediately, her voice becoming significantly louder and filled with rage. I have lived a long life and heard many tragic stories, Kachi, she said aggressively. Stories of foolish women standing loyally by broken men, suffering with them, sacrificing their young years, and believing in their empty promises. And then, when the man finally gets rich again, he completely forgets everything they did, abandons them, and leaves them behind for someone else. She pointed an accusing finger directly at Kachi's face, her voice trembling with anger. My daughter is not getting any younger, Kachi. She cannot sit down here and completely waste her prime years, dealing with absolute financial uncertainty. She cannot settle for a man who currently has absolutely nothing to his name and no clear guaranteed future. Kachi slowly lifted his head, looking at the raging woman, and spoke with an incredible, unshakable calmness. Ma, I completely and fully understand your parental concerns. I know that any loving parent who truly cares about their child's would feel the exact same way you do right now. But I swear to you, I will never do that to Tarilla. I love your daughter with all my soul, and I promise to do well by her. Mrs. Bulma stared at his calm face for a moment, letting out a loud, deeply disrespectful hiss. Then, she turned sharply and walked out of the living room, heading straight into Tarilla's bedroom, where Tarilla was folding clothes. Her booming voice completely filled the small space the moment she entered. So, this is the pathetic man you want to build a future with, Tarilla? Tarilla tried to speak, her voice defensive. Mom, please, he is working incredibly hard every day, but Mrs. Bulma cut her off ruthlessly. Working hard? Did you not explicitly tell me that he is currently working as an Uber driver? A full-grown man who is using your personal car as a taxi because he doesn't even have his own vehicle. Is that the champion you are waiting for? She walked around the small bedroom in absolute anger, her hands gesturing wildly. You will be turning 30 years old in exactly 1 month, Tarilla. Tell me honestly, how many years do you plan to sit here and wait for him to find himself? And if he keeps driving that taxi, how long will it realistically take him to save enough money to start anything serious? Even if he does start something, what on earth is the guarantee that it won't fail just like his last business? The questions came raining down one after the other, heavy, brutal, and incredibly hard to hear. Tarilla took a very deep breath, her eyes steady as she looked at her mother. I truly believe God will help him, Mom, she said quietly. He is trying his absolute best, and he is saving every penny, Mrs. Bulma shook her head in complete disappointment. No, she said firmly. I want a real, established man who can guarantee a secure future for you and my future grandchildren, not someone whose entire life is still a giant question mark. She stopped for a dramatic moment, her voice dropping, but her final decision was ironclad. I am leaving this house first thing tomorrow morning. I simply cannot sit here and watch my daughter ruin her life anymore. I will go back home and tell your father everything. Maybe he will be the most authoritative one to talk some actual sense into your stubborn head. In the adjacent living room, Kachi had heard every single word of the conversation. Her voice had been incredibly loud, passing easily through the thin walls. Kachi stayed very still on the couch, his head slowly going down into his hands, his heart heavy. He didn't say a single word in his own defense. That night, a terrible, suffocating silence ruled the apartment. No one spoke a word. Not Kachi and not Tarilla. The house remained perfectly quiet until dawn. The next morning, Mrs. Bulma woke up incredibly early, her face a rigid mask as she barely spoke a word to anyone. Tarilla tried desperately to calm her down and hug her before she departed, but her mother completely refused to listen to her pleas. I've made my position entirely clear to you, Tarilla. I will never support this ridiculous arrangement, and you will definitely be hearing from your father very soon, Mrs. Bulma said coldly. A few minutes later, she picked up her heavy travel bag and walked out of the bedroom with a firm stride. When she reached the living room, Kachi, who had voluntarily slept on the hard couch the night before to give them space, stood up quickly, looking surprised. Good morning, Ma. Why are you leaving with your bag so early, Ma? He asked respectfully. I swear I didn't mean to cause any trouble or family inconvenience. I can easily leave the apartment myself if you want me to, but please, don't leave your daughter's house in anger like this. Mrs. Bulma looked at him for a long, freezing moment, said absolutely nothing, and simply continued walking straight out of the apartment in pure anger, slamming the front door behind her. The house became completely silent once again, the echo of the door lingering. Tarilla stood in her room for a long moment, her heart incredibly heavy, as the emotional toll of the weekend affected everyone deeply. She walked quietly toward the living room, where Kachi was now seated on the edge of the couch, one arm resting heavily on his chin, his eyes showing he had not slept well at all. Tarilla stood there looking at him with an ocean of love in her eyes. Then she moved closer and gently touched his tense shoulder. "Kachi!" she called out softly. Kachi looked up, his face looking profoundly tired, sad and defeated, the cruel words from the night before still ringing loudly inside his head. Tarilla could see his internal agony clearly, and she immediately sat down right beside him on the couch. For a long moment, neither of them spoke a single word, just absorbing each other's presence. Then, Tarilla broke the heavy silence, her voice filled with a beautiful tenderness. "Kachi, I am so incredibly sorry about everything that happened yesterday." Kachi looked into her eyes, his expression heartbroken. "My mom was just being aggressively overprotective," she continued gently. "She was just worried about my security. She didn't mean to attack your character." Kachi lowered his eyes to the floor, shaking his head. "No, Tarilla," he said softly. "I should be the one apologizing to you for putting you through all this absolute misery. You and your own mother just had a terrible argument, and it was entirely because of me and my failures." Tarilla stopped him immediately, reaching out to grasp his face with both of her hands, forcing him to look at her. "No, Kachi," she said with absolute firmness. "None of this is your fault, do you hear me?" She sat closer, holding his hand tightly in her lap. "Kachi, listen to me very carefully. I love you for who you are, and I believe in your brilliant mind with all my heart." Kachi looked deeply at her face, searching her soul. Tarilla continued, her voice filled with an unshakable conviction. "Do not ever give up on yourself, Kachi. You are trying your best every single day, and that is the only thing that truly matters to me." She squeezed his hand gently, a tear of pure devotion shining in her own eye. "And even if the next business you start one day does not work out perfectly, we will still be completely fine. I am also working, I have a great career, and there will always be more than enough for us to comfortably build a beautiful family together. A man does not have to be a billionaire before he can build a loving family with me." Those incredible words entered Kachi's heart deeply, striking the very core of his being. He looked away from her for a brief moment, his eyes suddenly becoming wet with real tears as he became completely overwhelmed with intense emotion. But it was not because of his poor financial condition. No, not at all, because that condition was never actually real. It was because he could hardly believe that this kind of pure, unconditional, and selfless love truly existed in a world so dominated by money. At that exact moment, he realized with absolute certainty that this magnificent woman would stay by his side, no matter what catastrophic situation life threw at them. The very next morning, everything continued as normal on the surface. Kachi drove Tarilla to her corporate office as usual, wishing her a great day. After dropping her off at the entrance, he drove away smoothly, joining the morning traffic, but after a while he intentionally turned onto a grand tree-lined road he had not used in months. After a long scenic drive toward the most affluent sector of the city, he finally arrived at a massive, towering security gate. It was the gate of his private mansion, the exact same house that everybody in the city believed the bank had ruthlessly taken away from him. The private gatekeeper, recognizing the vehicle immediately, rushed out with a look of immense respect and quickly opened the massive gates. "Welcome back home, sir," he greeted, respectfully, bowing his head. Kachi drove inside the pristine compound quietly, parking the sedan next to his hidden fleet of luxury cars, and stepped down. Then, he walked with confident, powerful strides toward the grand main door, pulling his personal set of keys out of his pocket, the exact same keys people believed no longer belonged to his name. He unlocked the heavy door and stepped inside the majestic house, which was completely silent and immaculate. Kachi stood directly in the middle of the grand living room, looking around at his vast untouched wealth, and spoke softly under his breath. "I don't need a single shred of more proof," he said, a proud smile finally breaking across his face. He took a few steps forward, his expression becoming profoundly serious as he made a monumental decision. It is finally time to tell her the absolute truth. Kachi walked upstairs into his massive master bedroom, his steps becoming slower as a wave of intense memories entered his mind. He stopped directly in front of his massive walk-in closet, reaching into a small, hidden compartment built into the back of a mahogany shelf. His fingers closed around a small velvet ring box, and the moment he brought it out into the light, old memories rushed back to him. Many months earlier, Kachi had attended a high-profile alumni hangout with his old university coursemates at a luxury hotel, their usual yearly gathering to catch up on life. Most of the successful men had arrived looking incredibly happy, accompanied by their beautiful, elegantly dressed wives. People laughed, drank expensive wine, and shared proud stories about their booming businesses, happy marriages, and growing children. That night, Kachi had arrived at the venue feeling incredibly ecstatic. He had literally bought a priceless diamond engagement ring for Tarilla just a day before the reunion, planning to propose that same week. He had spent hours imagining how brilliantly she would smile when he finally popped the question. But something tragic happened during that gathering. One of Kachi's closest college friends arrived completely alone, without his wife. That was incredibly strange because every single year prior, he had arrived hand in hand with his wife. And everyone knew they shared a deep, legendary love that started back in their university days. Back when they were dating as broke students, everyone admired their commitment, and even after graduation, they remained fiercely loyal to each other through the early struggles. Now, Kachi stared at his friend from across the room, wondering why he looked so hollow and defeated, as if his soul had been extracted. Out of pure, genuine concern, Kachi walked over to him during a break in the speeches, and they greeted each other with their usual enthusiastic shoulder bump. "Where on earth is your beautiful wife tonight, man?" Kachi asked with a warm smile. The very moment the question left his lips, his friend's expression completely collapsed, the forced smile vanishing instantly from his face. For a long, painful few seconds, the man could not even find the strength to speak. Then, he finally answered in a hollow whisper, "She completely left me, Kachi." Kachi became intensely confused, his business mind failing to process the statement. "What do you mean she left you? Left you to go where? What on earth happened between you two?" The man gave a bitter, weak laugh that was filled with an unimaginable depth of pain. "I encountered a severe financial catastrophe 6 months ago. My primary business crashed hard due to a regulatory shift," he explained, his eyes watering. "I lost almost every single cent of my savings. I kept trying desperately to get back on my feet, working 20 hours a day looking for ways to recover, but things just became harder by the day. That incredibly difficult season caused an immense toxic strain in our marriage." He looked down at his shoes, a tear escaping. "After some time of being broke, she completely changed toward me. It was as though my very presence in the house irritated her soul. The mutual respect we built over a decade was entirely gone, and she began complaining bitterly about every single thing I did. In fact, it was so bad that I genuinely expected she would find a way to complain about the very way I breathed," the man said with a tragic broken smile. Kachi stayed completely quiet, a cold dread washing over him as he listened. The man continued, his voice cracking completely. "Then, one random afternoon, she packed up all her things, took our beautiful child, and left me completely alone in the absolute lowest, darkest moment of my entire life." Kachi placed a supportive hand on his friend's shaking shoulder, breathing in deeply as the horror of the story unfolded. Then the man delivered the final crushing detail. "Later on, after the official divorce papers cleared, I found out through mutual friends that she had immediately gotten married to one of my wealthiest business rivals." He gave a painful, haunting smile. "Imagine waking up every single day of your life, Hachi, knowing that your only child is currently living in a mansion with a total stranger, all because the woman you loved and sacrificed for completely gave up on you the very moment you encountered a hard season in life." Kachi could hardly believe his ears, because he knew that couple intimately. He knew how beautifully they had started from nothing. But now everything had been completely scattered and destroyed, because of one single financial winter. Kachi looked at his broken friend that night and saw a man who was entirely dead inside, and what he heard completely shattered his idealized views about love and relationships. When he got home that night, he could not stop his mind from racing. The gorgeous engagement ring was sitting in his closet, but a deep, paralyzing fear had entered his heart. The concept of marriage suddenly became terrifyingly risky. He sat alone in his dark room for hours, thinking deeply about human nature. He knew Tarilla was a kind, peaceful, and loving woman, and he had never seen a single reason to doubt her character. but the haunting words of his broken friend refused to leave his mind. All because the woman you loved left you during hard times. That terrifying question kept repeating in his mind over and over again. What if there was no money? What if his success vanished? Would Tarilla still stay? That very night, he made a risky, highly controversial decision to delay the proposal and execute a psychological test. He decided to pretend he had lost absolutely everything to see her true heart before committing to marriage. For months, the fake bankruptcy and the fake struggle had been playing out, and now, looking at the ring box in his mansion, Kachi knew he had his answer. Tarilla had passed every single test with flying colors. She had protected his dignity, defended him against her own mother, and offered him her car to drive a taxi. He knew with absolute certainty that she was a rare diamond soul, but as he prepared to leave the mansion to reveal the truth, a sudden terrifying anxiety gripped his chest. Would she ever be able to forgive him for lying to her for so many months? Or had his test completely destroyed the very trust he was trying to protect? The golden afternoon sun was beginning to cast long, dramatic shadows across the city as Tarilla walked out of her corporate office building, her mind still numb with the exhaustion of trying to appear normal while carrying a shattered heart. She stopped on the pavement, pulling out her mobile phone to dial Kachi's number, but before her fingers could even touch the screen, a familiar horn honked politely from the curb just a few meters away. She looked up instantly, expecting to see her modest sedan, but instead her eyes locked onto a sleek, incredibly familiar silhouette. It was Kachi's newest, most expensive luxury sports car, a vehicle she vividly remembered being cataloged by the bank agents for immediate seizure. The polished black paint caught the sunlight, gleaming with an undeniable aura of immense wealth, completely out of place in the middle-class reality they had been living for the past 2 months. Tarilla froze in absolute bewilderment, her boots glued to the concrete as she whispered to herself, "No, this is impossible. I know this car." At that exact moment, the driver's side door swung open smoothly, and Kachi stepped out, dressed not in his simple rideshare attire, but in one of his impeccably tailored, multi-thousand-dollar designer suits that made him look every bit the powerful multi-millionaire tycoon he used to be. He walked around the hood of the vehicle with a calm, commanding stride that possessed absolutely none of the heavy, broken posture he had carried for weeks. And with a gentle smile, he took her heavy corporate briefcase from her paralyzed hand. "Please, get inside, my love," he said softly, his voice carrying the deep, resonant authority of a man who owned the world, opening the passenger door of the luxury car for her with effortless grace. Tarilla stepped into the plush, leather-scented interior like a woman walking through a vivid dream, her eyes scanning the digital dashboard and the pristine, untouched controls before she turned around sharply to face him as he slid into the driver's seat. "Kachi, what is the meaning of this? How on earth did you get your luxury car back from the financial regulators?" she asked, her voice trembling with an equal mixture of profound confusion and sudden, rising panic. Kachi gripped the steering wheel firmly, his eyes looking straight ahead into the traffic as he started the powerful engine, which roared to life with a low, menacing rumble. "It is an incredibly long, complicated story, Tarilla," he replied quietly, his tone devoid of the anxiety that had defined him for months. "We will talk about everything the moment we get home." Tarilla stared at his sharp profile, a strange, sickening knot beginning to tie itself deep inside her stomach as she noticed that instead of taking the familiar route that led to her modest residential apartment, Kachi pulled the steering wheel hard to the right, merging onto the grand highway that led directly toward the most affluent, ultra-exclusive billionaire district in the city. "Kachi, stop! That is absolutely not our way home. Where on earth are you taking me right now?" she demanded, her corporate composure completely fracturing as she gripped the armrest in fear. Kachi did not slow down. He simply gave her a brief, reassuring glance that did nothing to calm her racing mind. "Please, Tarilla, just stay perfectly calm and trust me. I promise I will explain absolutely everything to you in just a few minutes." The car kept moving forward with terrifying speed, devouring the miles until they finally arrived in front of the colossal, heavily guarded security gates of Kachi's private palatial estate. The exact same mansion she believed had been ruthlessly repossessed by the bank syndicate. The private security team, standing tall in pristine uniforms, saluted Kachi with immense deference as they threw the massive iron gates wide open, allowing the luxury sports car to glide smoothly into the compound. Tarilla's jaw dropped in absolute horror and disorientation As she looked around the sprawling driveway, every single one of Kachi's exotic luxury vehicles was parked in its exact, designated spot, polished to perfection and completely untouched by any legal enforcement teams. The manicured lawns were immaculate, the fountains were dancing with crystal clear water, and there was absolutely no sign of ruin, default, or financial chaos anywhere to be seen. Kachi brought the car to a smooth halt in front of the grand entrance, stepping out to open her door. But Tarilla could barely find the strength to move her legs as they walked together toward the towering front doors of the mansion. Inside the grand living room, the very space where her world had been turned upside down months ago, Tarilla stood perfectly still in the center of the marble floor, looking around at the priceless art and the soaring architecture like a ghost haunting a past life. Kachi gestured gently toward the velvet couch where they used to sit as billionaires. "Please take a seat, Tarilla," he said, his voice dropping into a tone of immense gravity. Tarilla did not sit. Instead, she turned around sharply, her eyes burning with a sudden fierce intensity as her voice rose to a dramatic crescendo. "I will absolutely not sit down, Kachi. What is going on inside this house? Why are your cars here? Why is this mansion not locked up by the bank? Speak to me right now." Kachi closed the distance between them, standing just a few inches away, and took a long, heavy breath that seemed to pull the very air out of the cavernous room. "I have a profound life-altering confession to make to you, Tarilla," he began, his head lowering slightly as he prepared to deliver a blow that would shatter her trust completely. Tarilla cut him off ruthlessly, her hands trembling with rage. "Just say it already. No more riddles, Kachi. Just tell me what is happening." Kachi closed his eyes for a brief second, and then the truth came pouring out of him like a dark, unstoppable torrent. "I told you a massive lie, Tarilla. I never lost a single penny of my wealth. I am not bankrupt, my business empire is completely thriving, and the bank officials who came to this door 2 months ago were actually professional actors I personally hired to stage a default." Tarilla's face turned deathly pale, her breath catching violently in her throat as she stared at him as if he were a complete stranger. Kachi did not stop. He desperately hurried to explain the twisted psychology behind his actions. 2 months ago, right before I was about to propose to you, I attended an alumni gathering where I met a brilliant college friend whose entire life had been completely destroyed. He told me how his business had crashed, and the very moment the money vanished, the woman he loved and sacrificed for over a decade completely turned her back on him, treated him with utter disgust, divorced him, and immediately married his absolute worst business rival, taking his only child away with her. Kachi reached out to grab Tarilla's hands, but she pulled them back as if his touch were poison. "That tragic story stayed with me, Tarilla. It infected my mind with an overwhelming, paralyzing fear about the true nature of love, relationships, and marriage. I started asking myself the most terrifying questions every single night. What if my success suddenly disappears one day? What if I lose everything I've built? Will Tarilla still stay by my side, or will she leave me to rot in the dark just like my friend's wife did?" He took a step closer, his eyes pleading for understanding. "That is the exact moment I created a risky, desperate plan. I decided to completely pretend to have lost absolutely everything I owned. I needed to see with my own eyes if what we shared was real, unconditional love, or if it was just a transaction based on my multi-million-dollar bank account." Tarilla stood there, her body completely rigid as the full, monstrous scale of his deception washed over her mind. Kachi continued speaking, his voice breaking with raw, unscripted emotion. "But what I saw from you over the last 2 months completely shocked my soul, Tarilla. You did not leave me for a single second. You stood firmly by my side through every insult. You fiercely defended my dignity in front of that arrogant landlord, Mr. Apochi, even when you believed I had absolutely nothing to offer you. You stood tall and defended my honor in front of your own mother, risking your relationship with your family just to protect my broken spirit. You gave me shelter in your own home, and you even willingly gave me the keys to your personal car so I could work as a taxi driver and have a fighting chance to rebuild my life from scratch. You showed me the most beautiful, pure love when you thought I was a completely broken man with nothing left to my name." A suffocating, horrific silence filled the grand room, but beneath the surface, a dangerous storm was raging inside Tarilla's chest. Then something fundamental inside her soul completely broke. She stood up taller, her face carrying a devastating mix of profound shock, agonizing emotional pain, and utter disbelief all at once. She looked at him with an expression of pure horror her lips trembling as she searched for words that could possibly articulate the depth of the betrayal she was feeling. She took 3 steps backward toward the grand exit, her mind spinning so violently that she felt physically sick, as if she were going to faint on the cold marble floor. She turned back around to face him, her voice dropping into a dangerous, shaking register that was heavy with absolute, unadulterated anger. So, all these grueling months, you have been systematically lying to my face, watching me cry, and putting me through absolute psychological torture, all because you were insecure and didn't trust my heart, she said, each word dripping with bitter resentment. Kachi moved forward with terrifying speed, his hands outstretched in desperation. Tarilla, please, I am so truly deeply sorry. I was just a fool trying to protect myself. But Tarilla violently raised her right hand, her gesture so sharp and absolute that it instantly stopped him from taking another step toward her. I don't want to hear another single word or apology from your lying mouth, Kachi, she screamed, her voice cracking under the weight of a massive heartbreak. Do you even remotely understand the gravity of what you have done to me? For 2 solid months, you played a sick, twisted game, pretending to be a victim. And you never once stopped to think about how I would feel if I found out my entire reality was built on a web of lies. Large, hot tears started forming in her eyes, spilling over her eyelashes and running down her pale cheeks as her voice broke completely. Do you have any earthly idea what I went through emotionally and mentally every single night, thinking that the man I loved was genuinely suffering and going hungry? Do you know how many formal reprimands and queries I received at my corporate office? Because I completely lost the ability to concentrate on my work due to the sheer panic I felt for your future? She wiped the tears away aggressively, but they kept coming, an unstoppable river of pure betrayal. And all this time, my pain, my sacrifices, and my tears were based on a calculated lie. No, I don't think I can look at your face for another second. I am completely done with this relationship. She turned around with absolute finality, walking rapidly toward the grand mahogany doors to escape the nightmare. Kachi completely lost his composure. He moved with frantic desperation, lunging forward to grab her wrist, and before she could pull away, the proud multimillionaire dropped heavily onto his knees on the hard marble floor right at her feet. Please, Tarilla, I beg of you, don't leave me, he cried out, his voice broken into ragged, pathetic pieces as real tears finally filled his own eyes. I am so sorry. I am a completely broken fool, but I swear I cannot function or live a single day in this world without you by my side. Tarilla looked down at the powerful tycoon kneeling in front of her, her heart completely hardened by the sheer injustice of his psychological game. Then her eyes shifted coldly away from him, looking out the grand window, where her modest car was still parked in the middle of his luxurious compound. Her expression turned into an icy mask of absolute detachment as she turned back to him sharply. Where on earth is my car key, Kachi? She asked, her voice dropping into a tone of dead silence. Kachi lowered his head, continuing to sob and beg for her mercy on his knees, but Tarilla completely raised her voice, her words cutting through his pleas like a chainsaw. I said, give me my car keys right now. Kachi reached into his designer jacket pocket with violently shaking hands, pulling out her modest key ring and placing it into her open palm. She snatched the keys away without a single backward glance, turned around, walked out of the massive mansion, and slammed the heavy front doors behind her. She got directly into her car, started the engine with an aggressive twist of her wrist, and drove out of the billionaire compound, leaving the kneeling millionaire alone in his empty empire. Inside the grand house, Keiichi remained on his knees for hours, staring at the empty hallway as his broken voice echoed off the high ceilings. What have I done? What have I completely destroyed? That night, Tarilla cried until her eyes became heavy, swollen, and entirely red from the overwhelming pain of betrayal. She lay on her bed inside her modest apartment, staring blankly at the dark ceiling as the silence of the room mocked the immense sacrifices she had made over the last 2 months. Every single time she closed her eyes, her mind vividly visualized everything that had happened at Kachi's mansion, the luxury cars, the actors posing as bank agents, the hidden compartment in his closet, and the absolute reality that her pure love had been treated like a lab experiment. It was all a test, she whispered into the dark, those cruel words keeping her awake, hurting her so deeply that she felt a physical ache in her chest. The next morning, unable to face the corporate world or pretend to be functional, Tarilla emailed her office requesting an emergency 1-week sick leave, completely locking herself inside the house away from the world. At first, she thought about calling her mother to seek comfort, but after remembering the harsh, critical things Mrs. Bulma had said about Kachi driving a taxi before she left, Tarilla changed her mind, refusing to let her family celebrate her heartbreak. Then she remembered her absolute best friend, Isichi, the only person who truly understood her heart, and with trembling fingers, she picked up her phone and dialed the number. The moment Isichi heard Tarilla's shattered, breaking voice on the other end of the line, her expression changed to one of immediate, intense worry. Tarilla, what on earth is wrong with you? Why do you sound like your whole world just collapsed? Isichi asked, standing up from her seat. Tarilla tried to speak, but her voice broke into heavy, uncontrollable sobs, forcing her to gasp for air before she could manage a sentence. Can you please come over to my apartment right now, Isichi? Please, come with a few clothes because I desperately need you to stay with me for a few days. After about an hour of agonizing waiting, a soft, hurried knock came at the front door, and the moment Tarilla opened it, Isichi stepped inside, her face dropping into pure shock at the sight of her friend's completely pale, tear-stained face. Tarilla, my goodness, look at you! Isichi cried out, immediately pulling her into a tight, fiercely protective hug as they both walked over to sit in the small living room. Isichi held her hand firmly, looking into her swollen eyes. What happened? Did something terrible happen to Kachi's case? Did the banks do something else to him? That single question completely broke the last remaining walls of Tarilla's emotional strength, and she burst into an absolute torrent of violent tears all over again. Isichi pulled her close immediately, resting Tarilla's head against her shoulder. It's okay, my sister. Please, just breathe and talk to me. Tell me what is tearing you apart. Tarilla tried to calm her erratic breathing, wiping her face many times with a tissue, struggling to find the strength to explain the massive injustice. Finally, she opened her mouth to speak, but before a single word could escape her lips, another heavy, desperate knock came at the front door, echoing loudly through the quiet apartment. Both women froze, their eyes locking onto the entryway, and then a familiar, deeply strained voice came from outside. Tarilla, please, I beg of you, just open the door for a minute. Let's talk, please. Isichi looked at Tarilla immediately, her eyebrows knitting together in confusion, but Tarilla's face had instantly turned rock-hard with an intense, burning anger. That cold, unyielding look alone told Isichi that something incredibly serious and unforgivable had happened between the two lovers. Isichi stood up with a determined expression, walked over to the front door, and opened it only halfway, blocking the entryway completely. Kachi stood outside on the concrete landing, his hair disheveled, his expensive designer suit crumpled, and his face looking utterly exhausted and hollowed out by guilt. Kachi, Isichi said carefully, her tone guarded. Tarilla does not want to talk to you right now. She is in a very fragile state. Kachi looked at Isichi with pleading, bloodshot eyes, his hands shaking as he gestured toward the interior of the apartment. Please, Isichi, I am begging you as a friend, help me talk to her. She won't listen to my calls, she won't answer my texts, and I am completely losing my mind out here. Isichi looked at the once powerful multimillionaire looking so reduced, but out of loyalty to her best friend. She quietly closed the door in his face, turning the lock with a sharp click. She returned to the living room and sat beside Tarilla again, her mind spinning with a million questions because she knew how deeply these two people loved each other. She knew Kachi had been staying in this very apartment, humbling himself to drive a taxi, so she could not comprehend what could have caused such a catastrophic rift. What on earth happened between both of you, Tarilla? Tell me everything, she urged softly. Tarilla looked down at her hands, and then the floodgates opened as she finally told Isichi the absolute shocking truth of what had transpired the previous evening. She described how Kachi had picked her up from work in a luxury vehicle, how he had driven her back to his massive billionaire estate, and how he had calmly confessed that his bankruptcy was a complete lie, she explained, her voice cracking with pure disgust, how he had systematically orchestrated the entire fake financial ruin just because he wanted to test her love and see if she would abandon him like his friend's wife did. Isichi sat in absolute, stunned silence for several seconds, her jaw dropping as she processed the sheer psychological cruelty of the test. Then, her face hardened with an intense, fiercely protective anger on behalf of her friend. What he did was wrong, Tarilla. It was completely, entirely wrong to treat your pure heart like a game, Isichi said firmly, pulling Tarilla back into her arms to comfort her. Outside the apartment building, Kachi did not drive away. He stayed parked beside the curb, his eyes remained permanently glued to Tarilla's window. Hours slowly passed into the evening, but the multimillionaire refused to leave the premises, pacing around his luxury vehicle like a man possessed by absolute regret. After some time, when the night grew dark, he walked back up the stairs to her door and knocked again, his voice cracking through the wood. "Who is it?" Tarilla shouted fiercely from inside, her anger flaring instantly. "It's me, Tarilla. Please open the door," Kachi replied desperately. Tarilla answered from inside immediately, her voice booming through the corridor with raw emotional power. "What else do you want from my life, Kachi? Have you not done enough psychological damage already? I don't want to see your lying face ever again. Please, just leave me alone and go back to your mansion." Kachi stood quietly outside the door, his forehead pressed against the cold wood as he continued begging, his tears falling onto the concrete landing. A few seconds later, Isichi quietly stepped outside, closing the door behind her, looking at the wealthy tycoon with a mixture of pity and deep disappointment. "Kachi, listen to me. Maybe you should just go home for today and come back another time. I truly believe she needs space and time to heal from this blow." Kachi lowered his head, his shoulders slumping. "Okay," he whispered brokenly, turning around to walk slowly back to his car. The next day, true to his desperate resolve, Kachi came back again, standing outside her door for hours, and the day after that, the exact same agonizing pattern continued. Every single day of that grueling week, the multimillionaire kept showing up at her apartment door, humbling himself completely, but Tarilla steadfastly refused to grant him an audience, the deep pain inside her heart still too raw to forgive. Isichi kept trying to talk to her during the quiet moments in the apartment, acting as a voice of balance. "Tarilla, look, what he did was an absolute atrocity, and he was incredibly insecure. But you and I both know that he loves you to the point of madness. At least hear him out just once." Still Tarilla refused, her pride and her broken trust forming an impenetrable wall around her heart. Then on a scorching Thursday afternoon, Kachi drove into the residential compound once again, his face looking increasingly gaunt. As he stepped out of his vehicle, he saw Isichi walking out of the apartment building, dressed professionally for her afternoon corporate shift, and he rushed toward her like a drowning man grasping for a rope. "Please, Isichi, tell me, is Tarilla inside the apartment right now?" he asked breathlessly. Isichi looked at his tired face and answered softly, "Yes, Kachi, she is inside." Kachi did not waste a single second. He hurried up the concrete stairs to the door and knocked with a rhythmic, desperate urgency. Inside the house, Tarilla heard his distinct voice immediately, but she tightly closed her eyes and stayed completely silent, refusing to give him the satisfaction of an answer. Outside on the landing, Isichi paused at the bottom of the stairs, looking back up at Kachi before she left for work, and for the very first time she truly saw just how completely shattered the billionaire was. The crushing weight of absolute guilt and agonizing regret was written all over his face, stripping away every ounce of his former corporate arrogance. Kachi stayed leaned against the door, his voice dropping into a soft, heartbreaking whisper that passed through the keyhole. "Tarilla, please? I know you are sitting inside that room, and I know with every fiber of my being that you are furious with me, but please, just let me explain my foolishness. Give me one final chance to talk to you, to look into your beautiful face and apologize properly." Still, there was absolutely no answer from the interior of the apartment, the silence stretching out like an uncrossable desert. Kachi slowly rested his forehead against the rough wood of the door, and right then and there he made an ironclad, unshakable decision in his heart. He was absolutely not leaving this doorstep until he saw her face, even if it took days. He slowly slid down the length of the door, sitting directly on the bare, dusty concrete floor of the veranda, his long legs pulled tightly against his chest. Time began to move with an agonizing slowness. Scorching afternoon sun beat down on the landing, making the air stiflingly hot, but Kachi did not move a single inch. Sometimes, every few hours, he would gather his remaining strength, stand up on his shaky legs, and knock gently on the wood again, crying out her name, only to be met by the exact same cold, unyielding silence from within. The bright afternoon slowly faded into a dim, shadow-filled evening, and still Kachi remained anchored to the floor outside her apartment door, his wealthy lifestyle completely forgotten. The evening eventually gave way to a pitch-black freezing night, the temperature dropping drastically as a cold wind swept through the open residential compound. Around 8 p.m., the main compound gate creaked open, and Isichi finally returned home from her exhausting corporate shift, her footsteps echoing in the dark yard. She stopped dead in her tracks, her mouth falling open in complete, absolute surprise, when she noticed that Kachi's luxury sports car was still parked in the exact same spot outside. As she moved closer and walked up the stairs, she gasped audibly in the darkness. There was the multimillionaire, shivering violently from the cold night air, sitting directly on the bare floor beside the closed door. The very moment Kachi saw her silhouette in the dim hallway light, he scrambled to his feet immediately, his body trembling as he reached out his hands toward her. "Isichi, please, I beg of you, help me beg her for mercy," he said, his teeth chattering from the cold night. "I know I hurt her deeply, I know I committed an absolute sin against her trust, but I swear before heaven that I truly deeply love her more than my own life." Isichi looked at the powerful tycoon. Seeing the dirt from the floor on his expensive suit, and a deep sense of human pity washed over her. Then she took a deep breath and said, "I am going inside right now, Kachi, and I promise you I will talk to her one last time." Inside the warm living room, Isichi sat directly beside Torilla on the couch, taking her cold hands into her own with an immense gravity. "Torilla, listen to me," Isichi said gently, her tone completely serious. "What that man did to you was a horrific mistake, and he deserved to suffer for it. I know that. But please, you need to talk to him just once. You cannot leave things like this." Torilla stayed completely quiet, her face an unreadable mask as she looked at the kitchen wall, refusing to acknowledge the plea. The next morning the sun rose early, casting a gray light over the city, and Isichi got dressed to leave for her morning duties. As she turned the lock and opened the front door to head out, she was violently startled, letting out a sharp gasp of pure shock at the sight right there on the veranda beside the door. Kachi was curled up in a tight ball, completely asleep on the hard, freezing concrete floor, his body shaking uncontrollably from the morning dew and the biting cold. Isichi covered her mouth in absolute horror, instantly spinning around on her heels and hurrying back inside the apartment, calling out loudly, "Torilla! Torilla, come out here right now and see this with your eyes." Torilla walked out of her bedroom slowly, her brow furrowing with confusion as she followed her friend to the open entrance. The exact moment her eyes locked onto Kachi's shivering frame, lying there asleep on the bare, dirty concrete like a homeless man, her icy expression completely fractured, a wave of profound emotion washing over her features. Isichi looked at her friend, her voice shaking with a mixture of awe and sadness. "Look at him, Torilla. The multimillionaire spent the entire night out here on the bare floor, completely exposed to the mosquitoes and the bitter cold just to prove his repentance. It shows he is truly deeply sorry for his mistake. What else do you want the man to do to prove his love?" After saying those heavy words, Isichi picked up her purse and left for work, a little upset by the intensity of the situation. Torilla stood completely alone at the open door, staring down at the sleeping billionaire, her mind entering a space of deep chaotic thought, as the memories of their entire relationship came rushing back to balance her anger. Torilla stood frozen on the threshold, the crisp morning air biting at her skin as her gaze remained locked onto the fallen tycoon, curled up at her feet. At first, a familiar wave of burning anger and resentment threatened to harden her heart all over again, reminding her of the agonizing humiliation and psychological torment she had endured upon discovering his elaborate game. She remembered the tears she had cried, the panic that had consumed her corporate life, and the sheer injustice of having her pure, unadulterated love subjected to a calculated, clinical simulation. But as she continued to look down, watching Kachi's chest rise and fall in shallow, shivering breaths, the rigid walls of her defense began to crumble, cell by cell. She looked past the expensive, now ruined designer suit, and saw only the vulnerable human being beneath. The man who had held her gently through her own darkest days, the man whose laughter had once filled her home, and the man who was now willing to completely discard his immense pride, wealth, and societal status just to beg for her grace on a bare concrete floor. Little by little, her thoughts drifted back to the beautiful moments they had shared before this storm. She remembered how fiercely he had cared for her, how he had never intentionally brought a single ounce of sorrow into her life before this monumental mistake, and how deeply broken and terrified his voice had sounded on the night he confessed his sins at the mansion. A profound wave of empathy washed over her, melting the icy fortress of her pride, as she realized that his twisted actions, though entirely wrong, had been born out of a desperate, deeply human fear of abandonment. Tarilla walked around the small room one last time to clear her racing mind, took a deep, definitive breath, and stepped back outside onto the concrete veranda. She moved closer to his shivering frame, her hand trembling slightly as she reached down and gently touched his shoulder to wake him from his restless slumber. Kachi opened his bloodshot eyes immediately, his entire body jerking in alarm, and the very millisecond his gaze locked onto her face, he scrambled onto his shaky knees, his hands clasping together in a posture of absolute, frantic desperation. Tarilla, my love, please, I beg of you before heaven, just forgive me for my foolishness, he cried out, his voice cracking with an intense, unscripted agony. But Tarilla softly raised her hand, her expression no longer an icy mask, but a beautiful canvas of calm, mature understanding as she stopped him from launching into another frantic monologue. Come inside the house first, Kachi, she said softly, her melodic tone acting like a soothing balm on his tortured spirit. Kachi followed her quietly into the apartment, his steps hesitant and humbled, entirely stripped of the corporate arrogance that usually commanded the boardrooms of the city. Both of them sat directly facing each other in the quiet living room, the space charged with a profound emotional electricity, as Tarilla prepared to speak her truth for the first time since the betrayal. What you did to my heart hurt me more deeply than any physical blow ever could, Kachi, she began, her voice steady but carrying the clear resonance of her past pain. It was an absolute injustice to treat my devotion as an experiment. Kachi immediately lowered his eyes to his lap, his shoulders slumping in total, unreserved submission. I know, Tarilla, and I completely accept the full weight of my horrific mistake. I am so truly deeply sorry for the trauma I caused you, he whispered brokenly. I swear to you right now that nothing even remotely resembling this deception will ever repeat itself for the rest of our lives. Tarilla stayed perfectly quiet for a few agonizing seconds, watching the absolute sincerity and raw guilt wash over his face, before a beautiful radiant smile slowly broke across her lips. I completely forgive you, Kachi, she said, her voice filled with absolute grace. Kachi looked up at her immediately, his eyes widening in total awe and disbelief as he moved closer to her on the couch, reaching out with absolute reverence to hold her hands tightly within his own. I promise you with every single breath left in my body, he said, his voice trembling with joy. I will spend the rest of my life making sure you never regret this mercy. After that beautiful day of raw reconciliation, an incredible shift occurred in their universe. Kachi, fully redeemed and bursting with a profound sense of gratitude, began secretly planning something uniquely spectacular for Tarilla to honor her loyalty. Unknown to her, he spent the next 2 weeks leveraging his massive multi-million-dollar network to organize an unprecedentedly grand, breathtakingly expensive proposal party, inviting all their closest friends, colleagues, and loved ones to a luxury venue. When Tarilla arrived at the brilliantly lit hall that evening, her heart fluttered at the warm, joyful atmosphere, but her practical corporate mind still didn't fully comprehend the true magnitude of the celebration. It wasn't until the music softened and Kachi stepped forward into the center of the room, pulling the priceless velvet ring box from his pocket and dropping to one knee with absolute confidence, that the magnificent purpose of the event became crystal clear. Overwhelmed with a tidal wave of pure emotion, tears of joy streaming down her face, Tarilla happily accepted his proposal as the entire room erupted into wild, thunderous applause. Immediately after she said yes, Kachi smiled brightly and gestured toward the grand entrance of the venue, surprising her once again as a team of valets rolled out a brand new, custom-ordered luxury SUV wrapped in a massive red ribbon, a vehicle he had personally and meticulously chosen to replace the modest sedan she had so selflessly offered him during his fake ruin. 2 months later, their legendary love story reached its ultimate, most beautiful milestone as they celebrated their wedding in grand, spectacular style inside a magnificent cathedral, surrounded by a sea of proud family and ecstatic friends who watched them dance into a golden future built on a foundation of tested, unbreakable loyalty. As the spectacular wedding celebration faded into a beautiful memory, the cosmic scales of justice began to turn, bringing final and unyielding consequences to everyone involved in this emotional saga. For Tarilla and Kachi, life transformed into a breathtaking testament to true, uncomplicated happiness. Their bond, having survived the ultimate test of fire, was now completely unshakable, and Kachi made sure his bride walked on paths of gold, showering her with the deep respect she had earned when she thought he was a pauper. But while the kind-hearted heroes flourished in their complete triumph of justice, A harsh and unrelenting karma was quietly sweeping through the lives of the antagonists who had sought to exploit their darkest hour. The arrogant landlord, Mr. Apochi, who had so cruelly mocked Kachi and tried to manipulate Tarilla when her rent was overdue, soon faced absolute financial ruin of his own. A sudden and massive municipal zoning audit revealed that his entire apartment portfolio had been built on severely compromised legal foundations and embezzled funds. Within weeks, his properties were seized by the state. His assets were completely frozen, and he was evicted from his own luxury office in a state of absolute humiliation and public disgrace, forced to taste the very poverty he had weaponized against others. Even Tarilla's hypercritical mother, Mrs. Bulma, had to swallow a bitter pill of deep regret and shame when she realized that the man she had called a worthless taxi driver was actually a multi-millionaire titan who held the keys to her daughter's boundless prosperity. Hello, wonderful viewers. Thank you so much for spending your valuable time on my channel today. I truly, deeply hope this emotional story touched your heart and gave you something deeply meaningful to think about as you navigate your own relationships. One profoundly important philosophical lesson we must all take away from this narrative is that true love is never tested during seasons of immense comfort, high luxury, and effortless success, but rather in the quiet, agonizing moments of absolute difficulty and severe trial. Real loyalty, the kind that builds an unbreakable generational empire, is beautifully revealed only when life becomes terrifyingly uncertain and the material world strips you bare. At the same exact time, this dramatic story serves as an intense reminder that trust is the absolute lifeblood of every human connection. While love can survive the harshest winters of financial hardship, lies, manipulation, deception can deeply wound the very people we care about most, leaving scars that even a fortune cannot easily heal. What do you honestly think about Kachi's extreme decision to fake his own bankruptcy just to test Tarilla's heart? Do you believe Tarilla was entirely right to feel so devastated and hurt after discovering the complex truth behind his financial status? I would really love to hear your personal thoughts and insights on this matter, so please share your honest opinion in the comments section below right now. If you deeply enjoyed this instructive story and would love to watch more highly emotional, intriguing videos like this on our channel, please hit that subscribe button immediately and turn on the notification bell so you will be among the very first to know the exact moment our next thrilling story is uploaded. And if this message resonated with your soul, please give this video a massive like and share it broadly with your friends, family, and loved ones, as it truly helps our channel grow and continue spreading powerful life lessons. Thank you once again for watching, and I appreciate every single one of you. Stay blessed, keep your hearts pure, and see you all in the next spectacular story.